if you look at today's G6 versus the first one back 2 years ago, I think there was a remarkable difference, which is the convergence of thought on shared services and outsourcing, convergence of approach. 2 years ago, you would not have found such people from diverse backgrounds, because there were advisors up there who were BPO advisors primarily, and others who really had a stock and trade in shared services, who would not admit that shared services and outsourcing are two peas in a pod. They're two different ways of solving the same problems. And the fact that we heard 5 times today, hybrid approach, is really, shows that the industry has moved on. It's no longer an either or, it's an and. And I think if we had the time today, what we should have looked at is when is the right time to switch from a make to a buy, or even a buy to a make. So I think now the industry understands there's a convergence, true convergence in approach. I think the other thing that I learned today was the fact that there is far less friction between the advisor and the seller community than there was historically. As opposed, for example, to the meeting in Orlando where one of the providers said, you know, advisors are a pain in the derriere. Today we had almost a love fest between the advisory community and the provider community, and I think as one of the sellers so aptly put it, now the advisors are selling to the sellers of services. So the roles are fuzzy, much fuzzier than they were, certainly between advisor and seller, than they were historically. The advisors, to some extent, are brokers. They're no different in many respects, and some of them are my very best friends. They're like real estate brokers, and they are the vehicle through which many of the providers establish a brand, because they're the gatekeepers for the buying community. Less so than previously, but quite frankly, a very good provider knows how to work the advisor community very, very well. And there is a lot of quid pro quo that goes on between advisors and providers. That's not to say that it's wrong. Most of it is, 99% of it is above board. But there's far more symbiosis between these two communities than there was previously. I think to some extent, providers are reliant on advisors for a promulgation of a brand, the carrying forth of a brand, but in many respects they're less reliant on advisors to get to deals than they were. Clients are getting much smarter. They now really, many of them who have gone through multiple sourcing exercises, are now just as skilled, if not more so, because they understand their own context, than the advisor community. So there are more and more deals that are no longer going through the advisory community as a brokerage function, if you will, and going direct to market. Now, where the advisors are growing their businesses, because a lot of the pressure is off to outsource quickly for cost and to think through the process. The end game may still be outsourcing for cost, but there's still some time to think through the process. Should I source externally? Should I source internally? It really is the same process. Companies are stepping back and saying, what else is there? How ought I do this? Should I do some of the transformation? And I really do hate that word. Should some of it be done internally? Do I go to a third party? What do I do first? What do I do second? There's now time to ask that question. So you see advisors spending far more time than they did historically with what I call the fact of sourcing rather than the act of sourcing. So no longer it is a matter of, let's get a business case done, let's go to market, let's find a provider, and let's do a deal. Now there's more time to think through what's right for the company, and that's where a good number of the advisors are taking their time to look at the marketplace, and they have to be far more critical, and I'm saying critical in a good way, of the provider community. The information flows are far more free than they were just a couple of years ago. I think there's an acknowledgement by the unholy trinity, the advisor, the provider, and the buyer, that we really are all in this together. It is one industry. I think the client is far more sophisticated again, in the act of sourcing. I think the client has a lot of opportunity to pick up capability in what I call the fact of sourcing, the fact that they are going to make a change in their business architecture. What does this mean for the advisor? The advisory community has historically been very tightly focused on that act, going out and doing a transaction. Now with the fact of sourcing, there's a beginning before, there's a phase before the act, and there's also a phase after called transition and moving to steady state. So the advisory community is increasingly moving to those longer tail processes, not doing a deal, but what comes before, and importantly, what comes afterward. Do we see the buyer community buying that in droves? Some do. I think we've got a market that now, as the buyers become, as corporates become far more advanced, they know when they need expertise. And many of them have learned on the job and, quite frankly, have deeper benches and deeper insights than many of the advisors do, just because they've done it. I have some real facts and figures. I'm about to release a study on change management, and without stealing thunder in the study, I think there's a disconnect. The data show that there's a disconnect between who is responsible for change and who thinks they were responsible for change. I happen to come from the school, having been on the corporate side, that only the buyer, whether he's shared services or outsourcing, can affect his own change, because culture, relationships are all very complicated, and it is very difficult for a third party to come in and make the change. I think also it's fair to say that many buyers of services are very skeptical about the positioning of a provider to help with change management. That doesn't mean that there is not a role for the provider in change, but the provider does not, I'm adamant that the provider should not drive change. There's also a capability challenge, which many of the providers won't admit. A fleet of consultants, 25, 26, who have never lived this, do not have the authority to help. They don't have the war stories. They haven't been there. And many of the providers have staff who are offshore, who do not get a lot of the cultural nuance of change. So I think there are very few providers who have a deep enough bench and understanding and credibility, most importantly, with the client to really affect change management. Let's not confuse change management with good communications templates, or if we do this, this might happen. That's advise and warn, that's sharing of best practice. But change management is not about handing over a template to a client. And many of the providers, quite frankly, think that the sum total of change management. The industry really needs, it's funny, it's a dirty little secret in this industry. If you get a few drinks under somebody's gullet, they'll start to talk about the fact that I screwed up on change management. And I've been doing case studies for the last year that indicate that, but no one wants to stand up and say it because, quite frankly, it's business is left-brained, and if we talk about soft stuff like change or communication or rejection, it's quite difficult. The belief in sourcing is you will do it and you will like it. And what about the fact that this is good for the corporation? Don't we get? If you look at the people who populate our shared services and outsourcing initiatives, they're left-brain folks. That's okay. That's what business is about. But changing the way people operate, their organization structure, their capabilities is really very much of a right-brain pursuit. And I don't think the industry has come to grips yet with the importance of change management. Some of my research indicates that everyone believes it's important, but they really don't know what to do yet. They don't know who should be responsible for managing their change, how much resource they put into managing their change, and probably most importantly, there are no facts and figures that indicate if I spend 5%, 10%, 15% of my budget, my program budget, in change management, Am I going to have better change? I don't think we yet know what change management, the positive effects of change management look like. When we see cause and effect, because we're all rational people, when we see that cause and effect, I think you'll see a bigger embracing of change management. But a lot of this chit-chat about change management's the next big thing, I think is more smoke and mirrors than actuality. I really, really do. And I've spent the last year looking at change management, how organizations are changing, and it still is an afterthought. It's a classic case of the spirit is willing, but the flesh is very, very weak.